Hello and welcome to the Payday Report Green and Red podcast labor update with Mike Elk of Payday Report, and I'm Bob Buzzanco from Green and Red podcast. We're here to talk about what's been going on in the world of labor, working people, unions, organizing, elections, and working class activism, just kind of the whole nine yards. And Mike is the founder and senior journalist, the senior reporter for Payday Report. And we've talked a couple times recently about the successful UAW elections in Chattanooga. And now another election is coming up, also in the Deep South, in Vance, Alabama, a Mercedes plant there. And I believe the election is happening this week, I believe. So, and again, there seems to be reason for optimism, right, on this one.
Yeah, I think they're going to win by very large margins. I think about 60-70%.
Yeah.
I don't make these predictions lightly. Anybody who wants to bet me a beer on this one, I'll totally bet you an Iron City. But I think they're going to win by 60-70%. And I'm someone who's predicted losing elections at Nissan and at Amazon.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting here is there's a lot of interesting factors at play. Obviously, the stand-up strike is a motivating force. This has pushed people to action. But I think it's important to bring up that there's two other very big factors at play here, three actually. I need to go into mine because this success is very rapid. I mean, that we're going to hit Volkswagen and now win at Mercedes, right? This success is very, very rapid. And part of it has to deal with the fact that, one, you have German employers here, right? There's a new law in Germany that forbids certain type of anti-union talk, that punishes companies, that holds them liable. Uh, and they have German works councils. They have heavily Germanized, unionized workforces. So the union busting they have been doing is much lighter than in other places. They've had some signs. They've had a couple meetings. There's not been any major firings. There hasn't been any, there have been some people denied paid medical leave. But there hasn't been any of the really ugly stuff you would see in like a Norma Ray film where they fire people and, call the cops and play nasty, right? So that's one factor. So you have a positive example on the one side, which is the UAW winning this election. And then you have on top of it, the UAW coming in with this very positive approach of look what we can win for you, look what we went out and won for you, and we'll win some more. So then on top of that, like the Volkswagen plant, what's really interesting, I think Dave Dane wrote a great article about this in American Prospect, which is there is so much investment in the electric car sector right now that when at Mercedes they built a $1 billion battery plant. They did the same thing over $1 billion at Volkswagen. How do you go in and threaten a bunch of workers and say, hey, we're going to close the plant? Yeah, we just spent $1 billion, but we're going to, whatever. We hate you. No, that's not how business decisions work, right?
Yeah.
Labor, as we all know, is a relatively minor cost, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and this could be a bigger factor when we get into some of these other older factories that are
Yeah.
not connected to EV, some of the smaller ones, which is that, you're looking at like, Troy, Missouri, right? You're looking at a plant of 1,000 people. That's an older plant. You know, Toyota could come in and threaten to close that. Toyota is a notorious Japanese union busting corporation, notorious for it. They call it the Toyota way. It's about building team and using the team to discipline people. And so that's going to be much harder.
Sure.
Hyundai, Montgomery, Alabama, and Troy, Missouri, they've announced they're at 30%. They announced that back in February, but they haven't gone up to 50%.
Yeah.
At Volkswagen, Mercedes, they got up very quickly to those numbers. But they've always had 30-40% in those plants. They've had
Yeah.
30-40% in those plants for decades.
Yeah.
Um, they've had minority unions there. I would say probably closer to 40% in those plants, right? So there was already a big base of support. Not only minority unions had been there for more than a decade. They had been going to meetings with the German unions. The German unions had been including these minority unions and some of the discussions they were having. They were having meetings with Volkswagen and Mercedes management. So there was a structure, there was a leadership there that, they didn't have collective bargaining, but they were out there trying to fight, and they were also training people, right? So you have a base of people that are veterans of, in Vance, Alabama, we're talking veterans, 25 years of organizing. Kirk
Yeah.
Garner, who we have on our site, was involved in 25 years of organizing, right? Think about that. I'm 38, right? I was down at Volkswagen when I was 27, 11 years ago. And to me, to see 11 years of fighting come to fruition is amazing. To see 25 years is something I can't even imagine. This is a fight that started when I was in junior high,
Yeah.
you know, back in the late 90s, right? So, we didn't even have cell phones back then, right? And
Mhm.
that's the other thing that, the organizing model here has shifted, right? Um, in some ways, I think are very positive, but we'll have to see how it goes once we get outside of hot shops, right? So instead of having, typically with a typical traditional organizing committee in a big election, you meet 2 or 3 times a week, which with childcare costs and everything is hard for a lot of people to do.
Sure.
Now with Zoom, people can dial in, they can figure out what's going on, they can have one-on-one conversations, they can follow up on social media. Obviously you have the one-on-one meetings still, you still have in-person meetings, but you don't have to put that time commitment, that commitment to, rearrange chat. You get what I'm saying?
Sure. Sure.
You you can do these things. So instead of having to invest a lot of resources, and I think Eric Blank he runs the labor politics site, and he wrote that great book, Red State Revolt. He's a labor professor at Rutgers, and probably of a lot of the labor professors, the one I read the most because he's done a lot of on the ground reporting and he's able to combine it, which is when you have a big breakout moment like the stand-up strike, right? The stand-up strike is the carrot, right? There's not really a big stick from these corporations. When that's the carrot, and you can, boom, rush in a lot of resources quickly, because both in Volkswagen and Mercedes, you had a base of support, you had trained leadership, you had people who'd been preparing for 10, 15 years for a moment like this, who knew during the stand-up strike, this is going to come down the pike. So when you have that kind of infrastructure in place, you can build rapidly. Now, when they get to Hyundai, they fired someone. They're threatening to close the plant almost every day. That's an older plant. They
Yeah.
might do it. You know, the Korean trade unions are really getting kicked around right now. Unfortunately, I mean they're stronger in many ways than the U.S. unions, but they're not like the German unions. They don't have works councils. They don't have that degree of control, and I don't want to say co-partnership because I think that's a misnomer in labor management. A junior partnership, right?
Yeah.
Where you consult the junior partner and you have to get some degree of buy-in, and
Yeah.
they don't have that, right? So you're not going to see, the Works Council is getting much more involved than they got in the past, right? Which I think Steven Silva and other people brought up. So you're not going to see that. I don't know what those elections are going to look like. They announced several months ago that they were at 30% after the stand-up strike, and they haven't gotten up to 50% yet.
Yeah.
And they're saying they're going to get people up to 70% before they hold an election.
Yeah.
So I don't know if these are going to be two German companies that recently expanded that have, a heavy, that have a long tradition of organizing that took advantage of a moment, or if we're going to see a real ripple effect. I do think we're going to see a ton of suppliers organizing this summer, particularly in the electric vehicle sector. A lot of these auto manufacturers, they have to meet certain emissions criteria by the Biden administration. Dave Dana has a great article about this at the American Prospect. They have to meet them. And so, what are going to be the how do they step away from that? So I think a lot of workers are looking at that and thinking about that right now. And I think we're in an incredible moment because even if, we don't see a big breakout to the other auto sectors, I do think we'll see some. Look, as a reporter, you cannot predict this stuff with a crystal ball. I haven't talked to many workers in Troy, Missouri or Montgomery, Alabama. I've only read what I'm seeing, and I don't have any real sense of it yet. So
Yeah.
that's a wait and see. We'll see how that progresses over the next couple of months. But I can tell you, talking to suppliers, talking to people in other unions, machinists, steel workers, UE, bunch of unions, this is going to be a hot shop union summer. Hot shop, is a term they use in the labor movement to describe when things boil over and you got to press for a union election now.
Yeah.
The time to press for it is right now. So we're going to see a big, massive uprising. And I also think we're going to see a big uprising in the public sector. The largest union election this year in the South is happening in Fairfax County, Virginia. 29,000 teachers are voting to join the teachers union there. That's going to be a landmark election, which is going to help inspire a lot of other elections throughout Virginia, where a few years ago, a Democratic governor granted municipalities the right to collectively bargain.
Yeah.
The biggest growth in the labor movement right now is in the public sector, and it's among workers of color. Workers of color actually account for almost 100% of the growth of the labor movement, over 100% according to BLS statistics. White unions are losing members in traditional white manufacturing areas. So we're seeing huge growth, particularly in the public sector, particularly in transit, and particularly in other sectors. The kind of work that's been outsourced to contractors. And
Yeah.
at a time when we're talking about socialism, there's a lot of people in the labor movement that really poo-hoo public sector organizing. They say, well, we need to go do the private sector. And yeah, you need a strong private sector too. It's a lot harder. But it doesn't hurt to have an incredibly strong public sector. We're still only at about 35% of the public sector
Yeah.
unionized. And the majority of that or higher was. That will give every private sector union, a leg to stand on. And,
Sure.
look, when Amazon Labor Union was trying to organize out there, the teachers union let them use their office, right? Uh, you know, strong public sector unions lay the base for union organizing everywhere. They are the majority of union members in this country. So we're going to see a real hot shop union summer where you
Sure.
have to go now, where the moment is right now. And I think it's really going to change things throughout this country in a major way
Yeah.
that we haven't seen in a very long time.
My father was an AFSCME official, so I grew up with that idea of public sector unionism. And, what's it like about a third today? But private unions are what, under 10% still, or
Yeah.
is that picking up? I mean, do you like how much of the auto industry in the US is unionized now?
I don't know the exact number, to be
Uh,
honest. I should know. I should know.
well, I mean, it seems like it's grown in the last few
It's
years.
growing.
Yeah.
In the last couple of years, it's been growing. Um, but manufacturing is, and my father was union organized with UE for many years. It's interesting because my dad said to me at one point, when was the last time we had a plant of 5,000 people unionized and they won by 70%, like the one at Volkswagen?
Yeah.
Actually, the last time we had a plant of 5,000 people unionized was 1989. So to pull off that kind of win in manufacturing is pretty incredible. And I think it's also representative, right? To do these expansions, they had to bring in very young workforces. I don't know the demographics of these other places, but I do think this gives them a foothold. I
Yeah.
think, and not only that, it says, because, look, there's all kind of Swedish companies. Look, BMW has a big plant there down in Charleston. And I think there's another one up in Greenfield. I think Volvo has a plant out there in Charleston, I want to say too. Or no, it's Volvo, I think. Anyhow, a bunch of, European car
Yeah.
places where you can create those islands because you need those islands so that people feel they have somewhere to go, that they have a positive example, right? And I think what's going to happen, right, particularly at some of these suppliers, right? Chattanooga, Tennessee is a town of about 120,000 people, right? The biggest factory in town, 4,000 people unionized, right? So if you're working at some supplier that's a couple hundred people, you can go across town, make more money, work union.
Yeah.
That means suppliers are going to have to keep up
Sure.
or let the union in simply so they can compete. Because right now, in the manufacturing sector in the South, you have a labor shortage, a historic labor shortage. So people know in these regions, particularly when you have a union coming in. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how it goes when it gets out to other places. I do think they're going to find success elsewhere. I do think this could be the beginning of something.
Yeah.
But don't be dissuaded. Look, I love the UE. I think the UE is great. But just this week, You know, unions, UE's been winning grad student elections 90, 95%, places like MIT, huge margins. Grad student elections been winning all over. Princeton this week, the UE lost the graduate student election, right?
Yeah.
There was a decertification at a Nissan plant down in Alabama
Yeah.
of the U.S. So these things do happen. Every workplace is its own culture.
Sure. Historically, the South has always been difficult to organize, from the Operation Dixie in the New Deal era, onward. Um, what do you think accounts for this kind of recent, kind of success there? Is it they're kind of more attuned to local issues, just economic, poverty, economic problems? Why are we seeing now the South is actually emerging, and we're seeing like places like Chattanooga and Vance,
I,
Alabama?
I I think one you're seeing, the auto industry be there for a while, so there's not a fear of it leaving. It's not
Right.
like when I first went to Chattanooga a decade ago, where that plant's 4 or 5 years old, and people are like, "Oh dear God, thank God there's an auto plant in town. Thank
Yeah.
God," because there were a couple factories there. There were some foundries. There were some steel plants there, some tubing factory. There was a big tubing factory there. Um, so when those first came in, it was like, well, thank God we have this. And then I also think there's been a culture shift, right? Unions haven't been strong in the South in a long time, right?
Yeah.
So, it's not like the 60s and the 70s where, you know, and we know this history, right? Public sector unionism in the South was heavily associated with the civil rights movement.
Sure.
And the backlash against unionism in the South was heavily associated with the forces of the Klan and the white citizens' councils and all those other groups. So that old generation that really hated unions, that treated them as outside agitators, uh,
Right.
the Southern counterparts to your father's generation,
Yeah.
I want to say, you know,
Yeah.
that generation is no longer there. They're no longer the people in power. And at the same time, you used to have all these very conservative media outlets that the only way people could get news in those places was to get it through these local right-wing TV and news and radio channels and newspapers. Now with the internet and social media, people are getting news from different places, particularly the younger generation.
Yeah.
It's much more of a nationalized conversation, I feel, occurring now. That the regional issues, they try to play on this an issue in Volkswagen of, do you want Chattanooga to look like Detroit, right? Or or Ivy, who's the old governor of Alabama.
Yeah. Kay
She's
Ivey. Yeah.
Kay Ivey came out, and that's a good segue into the other issue. Kay Ivey came out and signed this bill that would disincentivize, cut tax incentives to corporations that voluntarily recognize unions, right? And she came out and said, Alabama isn't Michigan. I don't know how much that resonates anymore, particularly after you see people winning a big strike, right?
Yeah.
10 years ago, you would bash the UAW. It was, well, all those guys are going to go to jail. Uh, they're all going to go to jail, a bunch of them. And then, they agreed to a two-tier wage system as part of the bailout. They threw a lot of their members under the bus.
Sure.
So now you have what, their appearance of reform, right? Everybody calls themselves a union reformer, and we can get into these issues later. Um, but circling back to Kay Ivey, the group More Perfect Union Action, which is a political arm of More Perfect Union, put out an ad, supporting the UAW, and it featured Nick Saban, who's the seven-time national football championship winner, coach of Alabama. Uh, and in the ad, he's at some event, and he's saying, um, you know, look, I think college football players should be allowed to unionize. I don't see the big deal. It would really help us out. It would really, which I'm sure any legendary football coach at a program like Alabama would love, you know.
Yeah.
Pay these guys 50K a year to play football. Sure, yeah, we love it. Right. And as he was giving these comments, he said, look at, I don't know why people are so scared of organizing. Look at, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, I don't get why people are scared of organizing. Look at General Motors. That's worked out well. And he praises the relationship unions and General Motors have. So they put up this ad on TV and in the local press. And Nick Saban, who, by the way, owns a couple Mercedes dealers, he's
I
an
never knew
investor
that.
in
Not surprising,
car
but I didn't
dealers,
know that part.
right?
Yeah,
Sure,
sure.
I'm sure he was the most highly paid public employee in Alabama. I'm sure he's
Oh,
making a
he
couple
was
million.
making like 12 million a year by the time, just in base salary by the time he retired. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So, he comes out and says, I'm not supporting the union drive. And it's actually funny because Mercedes brought him in to give this sort of corporate pep talk about, we're all
Yeah,
one team. He didn't say anything anti-union, but it was all, Mercedes is here, everybody's listening. It was the play nice, sweetheart approach, right? Um, so he came in and he did this. And so then, More Perfect Union Action, which More Perfect Union does great videos, and then they have a political arm called More Perfect Union Action, uh, asked, uh, that Sabian, I guess, must have went to someone at the University of Alabama. University of Alabama calls up YouTube and says, "Hey, that's a copyright infringement. We'll sue you," because it showed the Alabama football logo, right?
yeah.
Uh, the ad's been taken off of YouTube. I've only seen
That's
it described.
Alabama's a public university. You know.
Yeah, and these were statements, and the pro union comments he gave were given at a press conference, right? And
Right,
it's just a clip of him talking for
right.
like 20, 30 seconds, and he's saying, "Well, look at the UAW and General Motors. That's worked out generally good."
Yeah.
So
Well,
Sabian backtracks it,
he grew up in
So
West
it's kind of
Virginia.
wild to think about the amount of money flowing in
Oh,
that a
sure.
public. Could you imagine if there was a union drive in Youngstown and Youngstown State called up, YouTube and said, "We're going to sue you"? Somebody had on a.
Oh, but the guy in charge of Youngstown State would. So, well, no, he's an ex MAGA Republican congressman who's now the head of Youngstown State. It's
Yeah.
terrifying. But Saban grew up in West Virginia in coal country, and he's always kind of said things that sounded decent, about unions, about race and stuff like that. He's not like Tommy Tuberville. He's not, Neanderthal like that. But when the money, when the rubber meets the road, I didn't know he owned all those dealerships, so that makes there's no shock there, right? I've often wondered if you could,
I'm sure being in Tuscaloosa and
yeah,
meeting this football champion, I'm sure he had some friends at the factory. I mean, look, they're bringing him in for speeches, right?
sure,
They're
sure, sure,
pep talks.
yeah,
Um, so it's interesting to see him do that, and it'll be interesting to see because there was some, I forget who it was, but there was like a former NFL star who went down there and campaigned with them. Uh, and the other thing, and this is funny. So you have the Alabama A, which is a big red
yeah.
A, right? So, and at the UAW local, there's printing shirts that say UAW with the big red A, and the
Yeah.
and the UAW has sent them a cease and desist letter as well.
Oh, geez.
They've sent them a cease and desist letter, and they're still selling the shirts, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know, of all the things public universities have to do right now. I mean, like, don't they have campus protesters to beat up in Tuscaloosa? Or maybe that's not
And not as much there, but yeah.
not as much
Yeah.
there. But if this was up north at Columbia,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
they
Well,
might be a little too.
yeah. Universities used to be considered public spaces, and now they're, just increasingly shut down and privatized, and people are getting, arrested merely for students who pay 60, $80,000 of being arrested on their own campuses. Which is interesting actually, because that's something we were talked about and you've written about. Because Shawn Fain a couple of weeks ago tweeted some stuff about the war in Gaza, which seemed encouraging. But when push came to shove, recently there was pressure within the UAW to divest and to issue a stronger statement, and Fain rejected it. Right?
Yeah, well, what happened in this situation was that, look, I think this is important to consider about reformers, right? When Sean O'Brien ran to be the Teamsters leader, right? He said he was a reformer. Next thing you know, he's appearing with Donald Trump, sending money to the Republican National Convention,
He
doing
gave
all
Tom
this stuff.
Cotton $5,000.
What?
They gave Tom Cotton $5,000. The
Yeah,
crazy guy in Arkansas.
I think they gave like 50K to the Republican National
Yeah,
Convention. That's like an organizer salary there
yeah,
almost.
yeah, yeah,
That's someone that could be out organizing members.
yeah,
Uh, that's not just writing someone a $5,000 check to attend a convention and maybe eat
yeah,
some food, right?
yeah,
Um, which I could understand. Oh, what, we went to a fundraiser, we paid 1,000. What, I don't like it. Um, but that's a lot of money. And then the crazy thing is there was a lot of people upset with Sean O'Brien inside the Teamsters, and they ran this website called teamsterslink.net, uh, which was like a forum that people could discuss in. And there were a number of big local leaders involved in it. Sean O'Brien sends a cease and desist letter to teamsterslink.net and says, you can't use the Teamsters. This is copyright infringement. Copyright. He pulls the University of Alabama on his own
Yeah,
members, right?
yeah,
So whenever anybody runs for union office against a incumbent, they run to the left.
yeah,
They say, "Oh yeah, when I take over, the members are going to be in charge, and we're going to win every day, and we're never going to lose." And they do that. So right now, 25-30% of the UAW is university employees of one form or another, a very kind of left leaning group.
yeah.
Um,
That's
and
a striking number. When the first
yeah,
time you told me that, I was shocked, really, that it was that significant. That's a big number.
well, they only have about 350,000 members or
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
400,000 members.
I remember when it was a
Um,
million, back in the
yeah,
day. And
and about 100,000 of those now are academic employees.
yeah,
So that's almost a third.
yeah,
Um, and when they're going into these union elections, they're competing against other unions. For a while, the UE was really leading the board. The UE the UE is a small unit, 35,000 people, but very left wing, very democratically controlled. Full disclosure, my father served there for 44 years. My great uncle and great aunt were both organizers there. They were called before the House Un-American Activities Committee. So there's a lot of that's my disclosure. I
yeah,
really love the UE. I think most
yeah,
people know. Um, but when you're going into these shops, right? UE was winning at Princeton. They lost to Princeton, but they were organizing the big prestigious ones. They won a huge contract at MIT, Dartmouth, Cornell, Hopkins, University of Chicago, Northwestern, and they were organizing at Princeton. I guess they just lost. I don't know the whole story yet. I haven't seen much yet, and I don't really report much on the UE since I have family involved. It would be a conflict. But, they were getting into this situation where, the UE has supported BDS, supported disinvestment in Palestine for a decade.
yeah,
This is a position. I think my father was in office when they did that. Uh, so that gives you an idea of, I think my dad's been out of office for a couple of years. He was elected director of organization there. Um, so UD's been on board with BDS and on board with all this stuff for decades, right? And they're very democratic, right? So they go into you know unions, right? When they go into a graduate employee, and the Biden labor board is allowing graduate employees in private universities to unionize, they're shopping for unions, right? They're shopping for unions all over the place. And what's happening is, people compare unions, and at the same time, they're competing against other unions. The NEA has various affiliates. The AFT has various affiliates. The steel workers represent the employees here at the University of Pittsburgh. Um, so there's a bunch of different unions competing, right? A group of graduate employees, if the UE is winning and is the top dog, I mean, they picked up 24,000 members in 1 year, which is way more than the UAW does. Then you have to sort of match the UE. So you saw first the nurses union, the UE, I think CWA came out, NEA came out, and then the UAW comes out for a ceasefire, right?
yeah,
Well, what does that mean, right? So a month later, and they come out for a ceasefire. Then at the end of January, they do an endorsement, a top-down endorsement of Biden at their political conference in D.C. And Biden is speaking, and there's UAW, rank and file UAW members on the floor, and they're literally dragged out. You can see it in video. Go to the Intercept. You can literally, this was in January, you can see them being dragged out while UAW members chant USA, USA. So UAW just had an opportunity to pass BDS. They didn't pass it. Uh, and this is an interesting question. So how much money does uh, the UAW have invested directly in Israel or companies that do business there? According to an interview in Jacobin with the director of Region 98, I forget the guy's name. Um, I think his name's Brandon. I forget his name, but the director of Region 98, which is the New York City base, which is a lot of graduate employees, a lot of museum employees, a lot of legal aid attorneys, and other big facilities there. Um, According to him, the UAW has almost $1 million invested directly in Israel bonds. So it would mean dumping those bonds, which probably wouldn't be too big of a hit.
That's not much. Yeah.
But then you get into the bigger issue.
Yeah.
Do you start divesting from the war makers? Which corporations do you start targeting? They represent all kind of defense
Sure.
workers at the UAW.
Oh, sure.
So they put this off on a study committee, right? Whereas, you have these universities being occupied, and Union Theology Seminary in New York just voted to
Yeah.
divest. Evergreen College, where Rachel Curry went out in
Yeah.
Washington State, and I know at a number of other universities they've started considering it, right?
Yeah.
Or
A
they've
couple of the California schools are, yeah, close to it, I think.
but even I've seen a couple local schools,
Yeah.
out this way, where they've said, "Oh, we're going to set up a study committee." Who knows where that goes? But maybe it's a step in the right direction, right? And they, there's actually been encampments that they've agreed with that process. So, where's Shawn Fain on this?
Yeah.
Why not just dump the Israel bonds
Yeah.
and do that? And so that's sort of what I mean is you have the labor movement is moving to the left more further than it was, but you still have a form of controlled leftism, professional leftism.
Yeah.
We can only go so far. It's not like people like me and you who are out there rabble rousing that aren't employed by any union that are just activists, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, these people are big institutional actors. And, look, during the State of the Union, President Biden called out Shawn Fain, and, all the cameras turned to Shawn Fain, and Shawn Fain's pointing back and, raising his fist and pointing there at Biden. And yeah, no, that's not what you do. I don't think
Yeah.
you do that.
Yeah.
I think the UAW has a lot more cards to play here, and they're not playing them.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to lead to disaster for the Democratic Party overall.
Within these unions like UAW that have a lot of student members now, is there a tension internally between like the older guys and kind of like the auto industry or steel industry against the students? I mean, is there kind of a sense that they're
Yeah,
kids and they
yeah. There's a very very big tension there.
yeah, that's what I
And
assume.
I think tension is the right word because obviously a lot of people came together during the strike in the auto part.
Yeah.
But prior to that, there was a ton of tension because Fain's base of support was the third of the union, that's university employees, and then what he could gather from
Yeah.
various places. Ray Curry's base of support was much more the guy he beat. He only beat him by like 500 votes out of 130 votes, right?
Yeah.
So he needed that stand-up strike.
Sure.
Fain needed that stand-up strike to unite the union. And I think Fain's kind of a left-leaning guy. I think he's a little weird, to be honest. I think he's got some people around him. I mean, maybe this is me being too Jewish, uh, but I find it uncomfortable when people go to union rallies and keep quoting scripture.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
if people want to go to church, they can go to church.
Yeah.
You don't, you know, it's one thing if it's a black person in the South who does it because of the role of that and the metaphors. It's another thing when you're a white guy from rural Indiana doing that. It's a little too much. And he's sort of developed, and I think this is my critique of Catholicism, obviously, which is that, it's a religion that gets into martyrdom. you know, no, it's it's true. I mean,
Yeah.
they get into martyrdom. They like this idea of saints and heroes. As Jews, we don't quite identify as much. And so I do think Fain loves this idea. He has
Yeah.
very, very good around him. It's all the old Bernie people. He has people producing slick videos, doing all kind of stuff. Fain loves it,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, and obviously he's maintaining this relationship, kind of an umbilical relationship with the Democratic Party, which pays. fewer and fewer dividends over the years. Out here in the Youngstown, Mahoning, and Trumbull County area, which used to be heavily blue. I mean, you go around here, Youngstown, Warren, Niles, and there's just Trump signs all over. And these are guys who worked at GM, they worked at Packard Electric, they worked at Lordstown, and union jobs, great benefits, retirement plans. They bought boats and Harleys, and now they're voting for Trump and think that the Democratic Party has abandoned them. And they've got a point, right, with NAFTA and all these other things.
Yeah.
And,
hey, I have to run to another meeting.
oh, okay.
But let's talk maybe this weekend, early next week.
Yeah. Well, as always, this is great, and we'll keep this up. We'll get together, and we'll always have stuff to talk about. So I appreciate it once again. This is the Payday Report, Green and Red labor update with Mike Elk of Payday Report, and we'll have this up soon. And please support both of us, PaydayReport.com and greenandredpodcast.org. And Mike relies on all kinds of donations and PayPal and stuff like that. So thanks again for being here with us, Mike, and we'll talk again soon.
Yeah, this one's for the workers who toil night and day, by hand and by brain, to earn your pay, who for centuries on past for no more than your bread, have bled for your countries and counted your dead. And mills in the shipyards and mines, we've often been told to keep up with the times, for our skills are not needed. They've streamlined the job, and with slide rule and stopwatch, our pride they have wrong. We're the first ones to stop, we're the first ones to die, the first ones in line for that pie in the sky, and we're when the grain is set out for the worker is working, when the fat cast about, and when the sky darkens and the prospect is war, who's given a gun and then pushed to the fore and expected to die for the land of our birth, though we've never owned one lousy handful of earth. We're the first ones to stop, we're the first ones to die, the first ones in line for that pie in the sky, and we're always the last when the grain is set out for the worker is working, when the fat casts about. To die, the first ones in line for that pie in the sky.